The morning my father won the case, he winked at me, right there in the courtroom, in front of the judge, in front of his attorney. He actually winked at me, like I was someone who had already lost and just did not know it yet. What he did not know, what he had completely forgotten, was that I was holding a folder. And inside that folder was a document he had signed. His own signature. His own words. Sworn before a notary public. Under penalty of perjury. He forgot one thing. Just one. And that one thing destroyed everything he thought he had built. Stay with me. Because what my grandfather left behind in a locked box in an old workshop and why he trusted me with key is going to change the way you think about family, loyalty, and what it really means to be seen. This is a story about the quiet ones, the ones who show up without keeping score, and what happens when the world finally pays attention. Because showing up matters. Presence is the one thing money cannot buy, inherit, or fake. And sometimes the person nobody worried about is the one who was being watched most carefully all along. If this story is already pulling at something in you, you are exactly the person it was made for. Hit that like button right now, not for the algorithm, but because stories like this one deserve to be heard by someone else who needs it today. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever been the quiet one in your family? The one who showed up when nobody else did? I read every single comment. Share this with one person who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories that actually mean something, subscribe. We will be right here.
The morning my father made the biggest mistake of his life. He was smiling. Not a nervous smile. Not a polite smile. The smile of a man who believes a game is already over. The smile of someone who has already counted the money, already divided the land, already written the ending to a story that was never his to finish. I remember the sound of the courthouse that morning. Footsteps on marble, the low murmur of voices in the hallway, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. And then, as we filed into the courtroom, a silence that felt like held breath. My name is Margaret Holloway. Most people call me Maggie. I have been a public school librarian in Northern Ohio for 38 years. I am not a dramatic person. I do not enjoy confrontation. For most of my life, I was the quiet one, the overlooked one, the one nobody worried about because I always seemed to manage. Always seemed fine. Always seemed like someone who had made peace with being in the background. But on a Tuesday morning in April, in Cuyahoga County Probate Court in Cleveland, Ohio, I became the most dangerous thing in that room. A woman with a folder on her lap and the patience to wait for exactly the right moment. The judge was the Honorable Patricia Harmon. She had the kind of face that revealed absolutely nothing and saw absolutely everything. She entered the courtroom at 9 o'clock precisely and settled into her chair with the quiet authority of someone who has presided over enough human drama to be surprised by very little. My father's attorney, Gerald Marsh, stood at the front of the room. He wore cufflinks. He spoke with the smooth confidence of a man who had already won this argument in his own mind. Gerald Marsh said, and I want you to hear these words exactly. Your Honor, the estate has been fully and formally disclosed. An affidavit of complete asset disclosure was submitted to this court, signed by Robert Allen Holloway, co-executor. Under penalty of perjury, the will is unambiguous. Margaret Holloway receives the items specified in Article 7. Nothing further is owed. He sat down. My father, Robert Holloway, leaned back in his chair. My brother Tyler exhaled slowly. Like a man releasing a breath he had been holding for months. Their posture said everything. The case was over. The money was theirs. The quiet daughter with the library job had been handled. And then my father turned in his chair and looked directly at me. And he winked. He actually winked at me. 62 years old. 38 years of helping children find books that could change their lives. And in that moment, with a manila folder resting on my lap, I thought about a single document. 3 pages, notarized, signed by my father 6 weeks earlier. The one document he had completely, catastrophically forgotten to think about. one document that was about to end his case, expose his conduct, and shock every person in that courtroom. Judge Harmon reached for her gavel. I stood up. Before I tell you what was in that folder, you need to understand the family I came from. Because what happened in that courtroom did not begin with lawyers and court filings. It began 40 years earlier, in a living room in Medina County, Ohio, where a little girl who loved books learned that she was the wrong kind of daughter. My grandfather, George Holloway, was the foundation of our family. He was a World War II veteran, a farmer, and a husband to my grandmother Eleanor for 54 years. He had the roughest hands I have ever touched and the gentlest voice I have ever heard. When Grandpa George told you something was true, it was true. That was simply the kind of man he was. My father, Robert Holloway, was something else entirely. He had built his identity on transactions, real estate development, commercial contracts, profit margins. He measured people the same way he measured property, by what they were worth on paper. By that measure, I was never worth much. My younger brother Tyler was the son my father had always wanted. Athletic, ambitious, loud in exactly the way my father admired. He followed Dad into real estate and never looked back. Family gatherings felt like business conferences whenever those two were in the same room. And then there was me, the girl who spent her Saturdays in libraries. The girl who became a teacher and then a librarian. The girl who received a handshake from her father at her own college graduation. Not a hug. Not the words "I am proud of you." A handshake. The kind you give a business acquaintance who has done something moderately acceptable. Grandpa George was standing 12 feet away when it happened. He saw it. He always saw everything. After the ceremony, he pulled me aside. He put both hands on my shoulders and looked at me directly. He said, "Maggie, do not spend your life trying to earn approval from people who do not know how to give it. You hear me? That is not a reflection of your value. That is a reflection of their limitation." I was 22 years old, did not fully understand what he meant. At 62, standing in a probate courtroom with evidence in my hands, I understood perfectly. I want to say something here, clearly, to every person watching or listening to this story. The work you choose has dignity regardless of what it earns. I spent 38 years helping children discover that books could change their lives. I helped struggling readers find their first story they could not put down. I helped teenagers who felt invisible find characters who looked like their pain. That is not settling for mediocrity. That is an act of faith in the next generation. And no bank account, no property listing, no business deal has ever been worth more than that. Do not let anyone else's accounting system become your own measure of what you are worth. After my grandmother Eleanor passed in the spring of 2011, everything shifted. Grandpa George lived alone on 11 acres outside Medina, the farmhouse where he had spent 50 years of his life. After Grandma died, the silence in that house became a living thing. You could feel it the moment you walked through the door, the absence of a woman who had filled every room. My father and Tyler visited on holidays. Sometimes I started stopping by on Tuesdays, then Thursdays, then most days of the week. We had a ritual. I would bring groceries. He would make coffee that was always slightly too strong and slightly too hot and absolutely perfect. We would sit on the back porch until the light changed. He would talk about the war, about farming in the 1950s, about my grandmother's laugh, about how America kept changing and how every generation was absolutely certain the next one was ruining everything, and how he had learned to find that funny. My best friend, Carol Patterson, had known me since our first year of college. She was a retired RN, sharp and practical. The kind of woman who could walk into any room and immediately identify who needed help and who was pretending they did not. She would come with me to Grandpa sometimes. Help me make sense of what the doctors were telling us. Carol used to say, "Maggie, do you know what I see when I watch you two together? I see a man who knows exactly who loves him." I never told her how much that meant to me. The last 2 years of Grandpa George's life were the hardest. 3 hospitalizations, arthritis that made walking painful, eyesight that weakened month by month, physical therapy twice a week in a clinic 40 minutes from the farmhouse. I was there for all of it. I held the clipboard at every specialist appointment. I organized his medications into a weekly chart. I coordinated his insurance paperwork, his tax documents, his home repair appointments. I drove him through Ohio winters when the roads were bad and he could not see well enough to go himself. One January night, a snowstorm knocked out power across most of the county. Temperature in the teens. Roads nearly impossible. I put chains on my tires, drove 20 miles through ice, and brought my spare generator to his farmhouse. When I arrived, he stood in the doorway looking at me like I had completely lost my mind. He said, "You drove in this? Maggie, you must be crazy," I said. "Runs in the family." He laughed. And then he got serious. He put his hand on my arm and said, "Showing up. Maggie, people underestimate what it means, not just to the person you are showing up for, but to yourself. It tells you who you are. Remember that." Meanwhile, my father and Tyler visited on a different schedule entirely. Their visits were transactional. They arrived with questions about property values and land assessments. They talked about development potential and estate planning and the future of the acreage. One Thanksgiving, dinner had barely ended when Tyler pulled out his phone and started showing my father property listings in Medina County. He slid the phone across the table like he was presenting a business proposal to his grandfather. At Thanksgiving dinner, Grandpa George looked at the screen for a long moment. His face was unreadable. Then he set the phone down gently, turned to me, and said, "Maggie, how is that reading program going at the elementary school? The one with the second graders?" That was one of the most deliberate things I ever watched a human being do. He chose people over property, right there at his own dinner table, in front of his own son. Later that evening, washing dishes together in the kitchen, he shook his head slowly. He said, "You know what worries me? Maggie. Some people become so focused on what a man is worth after he dies that they forget to ask whether he is comfortable while he is still alive." I looked toward the living room where Dad and Tyler had resumed their conversation about acreage values and development timelines. He did not say their names. He did not have to, about a year before he died. I noticed something changing. My father and Tyler began visiting more frequently. But these were not warm visits. They were purposeful. Doors closed during conversations. Voices lowered when I entered rooms. Documents appeared on the kitchen table and disappeared just as quickly. I caught fragments of words: attorney, transfer, restructure, before it gets complicated. One afternoon after they left, Grandpa sat at his kitchen table, looking exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with his arthritis. I sat across from him and asked if he was all right. He was quiet for a long time. Then he reached across the table and squeezed my hand. He said, "There are people who love you, Maggie, and people who love what you represent to them. The hardest days of a man's life are when he realizes the difference. And it is his own family teaching him." 6 months before he died, he pressed a small brass key into my palm. He said, "You will know when you need it. And, Maggie, when that time comes, do not be polite about it. You have more right to the truth than anyone in this family." I laughed and told him he sounded like a mystery novel. He did not laugh back. He just held my hand for a moment and looked at me with those quiet, serious eyes that had seen more of the world than most people ever would. I slipped the key into my purse and, in the chaos of the months that followed, forgot about it. I wish I had not. Grandpa George passed on a Sunday morning in late October, peacefully, in his own bed, in the farmhouse where he had spent 50 years of his life. The hospice nurse called me at 6:47 in the morning. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time before I could stand up. The grief hit harder than I expected. At 62, I had lost people before, friends, colleagues, my mother. But losing Grandpa George felt different. It felt like losing the last person who had ever truly seen me. The funeral brought out more than 300 people, farmers and veterans from the local VFW post, former neighbors, his church congregation. People drove 90 minutes to be there. The line of mourners stretched out the door of the funeral home and down the sidewalk onto the street. That alone should have told everyone something about the kind of man he had been. My father checked his phone during the eulogy. I saw it. Carol saw it. The funeral director saw it. These things do not go unnoticed. At the reception afterward, surrounded by Grandpa's church friends and neighbors and people who had known our family for 40 years, my father found me near the window. He did not lower his voice enough. He said, "Margaret, I need to be straightforward with you. Tyler and I have been working with the estate attorneys for several months now. The paperwork is essentially complete. It would be smoother for everyone if you simply stepped back from the legal process. You were never involved in the financial side of things anyway. He said this to me at my grandfather's funeral reception, while the man's friends were eating and remembering him 20 feet away. I looked at my father, and I said the truest thing I could manage. I said, I drove your father to chemotherapy for 14 months. Robert, I sat in those waiting rooms. I held his hand during the bad scans. I drove home alone afterward and cried in my car so he would not see. I organized his medications, his insurance paperwork, his specialist appointments, his tax documents. The only thing I was not involved in was his money. And apparently, that is the only thing that counts to you. He walked away without responding. Carol appeared at my elbow. She had heard every word. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, quietly, what are you going to do? I said, I do not know yet. She said, yes, you do. She was right. 2 weeks after the funeral, the legal notices began arriving. Probate filings, court schedules, attorney letters that used careful language to say, in very polished terms, that I was owed nothing. And then came a document that stopped my breath. It was called an affidavit of complete asset disclosure. My father had signed it 6 weeks after Grandpa George died, in front of a notary public, submitted to the probate court, in plain language. It was my father swearing, under penalty of perjury, before the court of Cuyahoga County, that he had conducted a thorough review of George Holloway's assets. And that everything, every account, every property, every financial holding was fully represented in the will being submitted. Every single asset accounted for, complete. His signature at the bottom, his thumb pressed to a notary seal. I read it 3 times. Then I thought about a brass key I had been carrying in my purse for 6 months. I found the key on a Wednesday evening, 3 weeks after the funeral, when it fell out of my purse while I was looking for my phone. I sat at my kitchen table and stared at it for a long time. You will know when you need it. I called Carol. I told her about the key. I told her about the affidavit. I told her that something was not adding up, and I did not know what I was looking for, but I thought I needed to look. She said, how fast can you get to the farmhouse? I said, 20 minutes. She said, I will meet you there. We searched for nearly 2 hours. The house first, then the workshop. Carol found it in the base of an old metal storage cabinet, painted the same forest green as the cabinet itself. Nearly invisible unless you were specifically looking. A fireproof lockbox, bolted to the interior shelf. My hands were shaking when I turned the key. Inside were 5 things. A sealed envelope with my full name written on the front in Grandpa's handwriting. A legal folder marked with the name Whitfield and Associates. Estate planning, Columbus, Ohio. A small USB drive, taped to an index card. The card said, play this when you are ready. Do not rush. Signed, Jeet H. A handwritten letter, 3 pages long. And at the very bottom, a single printed sheet on official letterhead. An internal memo from Whitfield and Associates, dated 4 years earlier, confirming the establishment and full funding of an irrevocable private trust, the George William Holloway Family Trust, executed legally, witnessed, notarized, filed with independent counsel. I read it 3 times. Then I thought about the affidavit my father had signed. Every asset accounted for, complete, nothing left undeclared. But here, in my hands, was proof that 4 years before he died, Grandpa George had already moved his most significant assets somewhere else entirely. Somewhere my father had never thought to look. Somewhere that a small brass key could open. Carol put her hand over mine. We plugged the USB drive into my laptop and listened together. Grandpa's voice filled the kitchen. Clear, deliberate. The voice of a man who had spent a lifetime saying exactly what he meant and meaning exactly what he said. He described meetings over a period of 2 years. My father and Tyler had visited the farmhouse with documents. They explained things quickly, used language he did not fully understand. Told him the estate restructuring was for his protection. Told him it would simplify things after he was gone. Told him Maggie would be taken care of. He had recorded 3 of those meetings on his personal phone without telling them. In the second recording, you could hear my father's voice clearly. He was explaining a document, moving fast, using terms like routine restructuring and standard estate optimization. And then Grandpa George asked a question. Simple, direct. He said, Robert, if I sign this, Does Maggie lose anything she would otherwise have received? Silence on the recording. 4 seconds. My father said, Dad, we have been through this. Maggie is provided for. This is about preserving what Tyler and I have built with your guidance over the years. And Grandpa George said, That is not what I asked you. Another silence. 7 seconds. My father said, sign where Gerald indicated. Dad, we need to get this finalized before the end of the quarter. Carol squeezed my hand so hard it hurt. I did not ask her to stop. That was the moment Grandpa George stopped trusting his son. I know it because of what he did the very next day. He picked up the phone and called Charles Whitfield. Charles Whitfield was a retired estate attorney in Columbus, 79 years old at the time. No connection to my father's legal team. No connection to anyone in our family. Grandpa had found him through a Veterans Affairs legal assistance program. He retained Whitfield privately, paid him from a personal account my father did not know existed, and over the following 18 months, quietly and legally transferred his most significant assets into the George William Holloway Family Trust. The farmhouse, the 11 acres, his primary investment accounts, a commercial property he had owned for 30 years, named beneficiary of the trust, Margaret Ann Holloway. The trust included a statement written entirely in Grandpa's own words. I will share part of it now, because I think he would have wanted it said out loud. He wrote, I transfer these assets to my granddaughter Margaret, not because others are undeserving by blood, but because Margaret has demonstrated the only kind of character that cannot be inherited, the willingness to be present without expectation of reward. The people who invest in a person's life, not their estate, are the people who understand what family actually means. Margaret understands this. I trust her with what I leave behind because she has already proven she can be trusted with what is most difficult to give. Time, attention, and love freely offered. I sat on the floor of that workshop for a very long time. Then I called Sandra Pierce, estate attorney. I told her I needed an emergency appointment. I told her to bring everything she knew about probate law and sworn affidavits. The night before the first hearing, Sandra and I sat at my kitchen table with everything spread out between us. The trust documents, the recordings, which she had reviewed and confirmed as admissible evidence. Charles Whitfield's files, which he had provided immediately and completely upon Sandra's first call. His records were extraordinary. Every meeting with Grandpa George documented. Every concern recorded. Every decision preserved with the precision of a man who had learned in a war that preparation was survival. And then Sandra placed one document in the center of the table, the affidavit of complete asset disclosure. She looked at me carefully and said, Maggie, do you understand what this is? I said. He swore to the court that all of Grandpa's assets were in the will. She said, under penalty of perjury, yes. I said, but the most valuable assets. The farmhouse, the land, the investment accounts. Those were transferred into the trust 4 years ago. They were never part of the estate he was declaring. Sandra said, which means the affidavit is materially false, whether he knew about the trust or not. And we will let the court decide that question. He signed a document swearing to a completeness that did not exist. That is the single most significant legal error in this entire case. And he made it himself, voluntarily, in writing, with a notary present. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, he forgot the trust existed. Sandra said, he was so certain, so confident that everything was his to declare, that he signed a sworn legal statement without stopping to verify whether there was anything he might have missed. He rushed. He assumed, and he underestimated. One signature, one forgotten possibility, one document. That was all it took. I want to stop here and speak directly to anyone who is navigating something like this in their own family, or who has an elderly parent whose estate is being managed by other family members. Every adult in the United States has the right to independent legal counsel regarding their own estate, not the family attorney, not a lawyer hired by a son or daughter, an attorney of their own choosing, retained with their own funds, with no obligation to report to anyone else. Every adult has the right to understand every document they are asked to sign. If someone is being rushed through paperwork, especially during illness or recovery or grief, that is a warning sign that deserves attention. My grandfather protected himself, but he had to do it alone, in secret, because the people who should have protected him were the ones he needed protection from. He should not have had to do that alone. No one should. If you are concerned about an elderly person in your life, please look into adult protective services in your state. The National Elder Law Foundation has resources that are free and accessible. These organizations exist because this situation is not uncommon. Please use them. I did not sleep that night before hearing. Not because I was afraid of losing, because I was about to walk into a courtroom and publicly expose my father's conduct. And despite the recordings, despite the trust, despite the wink I was certain was coming, part of me was still grieving the father I had always wanted him to be. Carol came over at 7 in the morning. She brought coffee and said nothing. We sat at the kitchen table together until it was time to go. That is what a real friend looks like. The first probate hearing was held on a Tuesday in early spring. Cold, the kind of Ohio morning that has not yet decided whether to be winter. Sandra and I arrived early. I sat in the second row with the folder on my lap and breathed. My father and Tyler arrived together. Tyler was wearing a new suit. My father had the posture of a man who has already written the ending to a story and is simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. Gerald Marsh presented the will within the first 8 minutes. He was efficient, almost bored. He referenced the affidavit of complete asset disclosure by name, noted its submission date, confirmed my father's signature and the notarization, and then summarized the will's contents with the brisk confidence of a man who expects no resistance. He sat down. My father leaned back in his chair. Tyler exhaled. Judge Harmon reached for her gavel. My father turned and looked at me across the courtroom, and he winked. I looked back at him, steady, calm. Then I stood up. Judge Harmon looked at me with an expression that was not unkind. She said, "Ms. Holloway, do you wish to address the court?" I said, "Yes." "Your Honor, I do." My voice surprised me. No tremor, no apology built into the tone, just words. Clear and even. I said, "Your Honor, before this court accepts the affidavit of complete asset disclosure as accurate, I need to present documentation establishing that it is not accurate. Specifically, evidence of a separate legal instrument that was not disclosed in the estate filing, and which directly contradicts the sworn declaration submitted to this court." The room changed. I felt it before I saw it. Tyler's hands went flat on the table. My father leaned forward. Gerald Marsh adjusted his glasses and stared at the folder in my hands as though he were trying to see through it. Judge Harmon set down her gavel. She said, "Proceed." "Miss Holloway." Sandra approached the bench with the trust documentation first. The George William Holloway Family Trust, established 4 years prior to George Holloway's death. Properly executed, witnessed, notarized, filed with independent counsel, and fully funded. Judge Harmon reviewed it page by page. The courtroom was completely silent for 9 minutes. I counted. When she looked up, she turned directly to Gerald Marsh. She said, "Mr. Marsh, are you familiar with this instrument?" Marsh looked at my father. My father looked at the table. Marsh said, "We were not informed of any such trust." "Your Honor," Judge Harmon said, "I see. And the affidavit of complete asset disclosure that your client submitted to this court, in which he swore under penalty of perjury that all assets belonging to George Holloway's estate had been identified and fully accounted for. Was that affidavit prepared with knowledge of this trust instrument?" Silence fell over the room like something physical. Marsh opened his mouth. "Closed it," Judge Harmon said. "Mr. Marsh, I am going to ask you to be very careful with your next sentence." Then Sandra placed the second item on the table, a printed transcript, in a USB drive in a sealed evidence bag. She said, "Your Honor, audio recordings." 3. Made by George Holloway on his personal device during meetings with the co-executors of his estate, during the period in which the restructuring of his accounts was discussed. Tyler put his face in his hands. "My father went a color I do not have a word for." Judge Harmon said, "This court is ordering a full suspension of probate proceedings, pending independent review of all submitted materials. The affidavit of complete asset disclosure is flagged for formal review. We will reconvene in 30 days. The gavel came down. For the first time all morning, my father looked afraid. During the recess, he found me alone in the corridor. No attorney beside him, no Tyler. Just the two of us under the fluorescent lights with the ventilation system humming overhead. He looked smaller than I remembered. He said, "Where did you get those documents?" I said, "Grandpa left them for me." He said, "You have to understand. We were protecting the estate. We were protecting what he built. I said, Robert, stop. I drove your father to chemotherapy for 14 months. I sat in those waiting rooms, and you stood in front of a notary public and swore under penalty of perjury that you had accounted for every single asset he owned. You signed that without checking, without asking, without stopping to consider whether there was something you had missed. That was not protecting his estate. That was assuming you already owned it. He said nothing. His jaw tightened, then released. I walked back into the courtroom. Carol was waiting just inside the doors. She handed me a bottle of water and looked at my face. She said, "You okay?" I said, "Yeah, I really am." The investigation lasted 28 days. Sandra updated me every few days. Each conversation revealed something new. The financial records showed a consistent pattern across 4 years. Various restructuring decisions had been made regarding Grandpa's accounts. Power of attorney documents had been signed. Some of those signings occurred during periods when Grandpa's medical records showed he was recovering from hospitalization. Not necessarily theft, but a documented pattern of financial decisions made for an elderly man without ensuring he fully understood what he was agreeing to. And against that pattern, an irrevocable trust, independently established, with assets already legally transferred and protected. Whatever my father and Tyler had tried to accomplish, Grandpa George had already moved the pieces off the board. The call I did not expect came on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks into the investigation. The caller ID showed the name Diane Holloway. Tyler's wife. We had never been close. She was polite at family events, careful. The kind of woman who always knew what was in a room and chose her words accordingly. I almost did not answer. I did. She asked if we could meet. A diner on Route 18, she said, because Tyler never went there. I went. She sat across from me with her hands wrapped around a coffee mug. She looked like someone who had been carrying something for too long and had finally decided to put it down. She said, "I want you to know something, Maggie. 2 years ago, I told Tyler that what they were doing was not right. I told him that George deserved to understand what he was signing. I told him that moving an 86-year-old man through legal paperwork during a recovery period, with language he did not fully understand, was wrong. Tyler told me to stay out of it. He said it was family business." She paused. Then she said, "I should have pushed harder." I did not. "I am sorry." I looked at her for a long moment. I said, "Why are you telling me this now?" She said, "Because I have a daughter. She is 11 years old, and I do not want her growing up believing that the people who show up and love without keeping score. I do not want her watching those people get erased. And because what they did was wrong. That matters more than being loyal to wrong." I reached across the table and took her hand. She had just become a witness. I want to pause on what Diane did, because I think it deserves recognition. She made a choice that would fracture her marriage and her relationship with her in-laws. She told the truth when silence would have been so much more convenient. We celebrate big dramatic acts of courage, but this is what real moral courage actually looks like most of the time. It is a phone call made in private, a meeting at a diner on a road your husband never takes, a decision to say this is wrong even when the cost of saying it is very high. Diane made the harder choice. Charles Whitfield was deposed during the same period. 81 years old, as sharp as anyone half his age. His records were immaculate. Every meeting with Grandpa George documented. Every concern expressed. Every decision explained in detail. The memo that stood out most was one he had written to his own file after their very first meeting. It read, "Client George William Holloway expresses concern that certain family members are treating estate planning as a personal transaction rather than a reflection of his own wishes. Client wishes to ensure assets benefit individuals he trusts rather than individuals who merely expect to inherit." I read that sentence 4 times. Then I thought about Thanksgiving dinner, and a phone slid across a table, and a man who changed the subject on purpose and talked about a reading program for second graders because he had already decided which kind of people were worth his time. The final hearing was on a Friday in late April. The rain that had followed us all week finally stopped that morning, the way Ohio springs sometimes do. As if the weather had finally gotten tired of arguing, I arrived alone. Carol had offered to come. I told her I needed to walk into that room as myself, without anyone holding me up. She understood. Dad and Tyler were already seated when I entered. The difference from the first hearing was impossible to ignore. No new suits. No confidence in their posture. Tyler's leg bounced under the table. My father sat very still, the way people sit when they are managing something they can barely contain. He did not look at me when I sat down. The independent examiner presented his findings for nearly 50 minutes. Financial records, trust documentation, medical records cross-referenced with document signing dates, caregiver interviews, neighbor statements, Charles Whitfield's deposition, and Diane's sworn testimony. And then the recordings. All three. The courtroom heard my grandfather's voice, an 86-year-old man asking careful, measured questions, being answered with confident reassurances that did not actually answer anything, being told to sign where indicated because the quarter was ending. My father did not look up from the table when his own voice played back in that room. When the recordings concluded, Judge Harmon removed her glasses, set them on the bench. Then she looked directly at my father. She said, "Mr. Holloway, on February 14th of this year, you submitted an affidavit of complete asset disclosure to this court. You signed that document under penalty of perjury. In that document, you swore that all assets belonging to your father's estate had been identified, accounted for, and were fully represented in the will submitted for probate." My father said nothing. Judge Harmon continued. The George William Holloway Family Trust contains the farmhouse, 11 acres of property, and the primary investment accounts representing the substantial majority of George Holloway's net worth. This trust was established 4 years prior to his death and has been in continuous legal existence since that time. It was never part of the estate declared in your affidavit. The assets it contains were never legally available for distribution under the will you submitted. She paused for a moment, and the entire room seemed to breathe together. She said, "This court finds that the affidavit of complete asset disclosure was materially inaccurate, whether that inaccuracy resulted from negligence or deliberate misrepresentation. That question is referred to the appropriate county authority for further review. What this court determines today is the legal validity of the trust instrument itself." She picked up her gavel. "The George William Holloway Family Trust is valid. Its provisions are legally binding and will be honored in full. The probate estate will be administered only as to assets not previously transferred into trust, which the record establishes is considerably less than what was represented in the submitted will. The matter of the affidavit is formally referred for investigation. This court is adjourned." The gavel came down. Tyler put his face in his hands. My father stared at the wall across the room. Not at me. Not at the judge. At the blank wall, like a man looking for a door in a room that does not have one. I sat very still. I thought about a back porch in Medina. Terrible coffee. The way evening light moved across 11 acres of farmland in the late summer. The sound of my grandfather telling stories about people who had lived and loved and mattered long before any of us had arrived to complicate things. I thought about a brass key and about the man who had pressed it into my palm and trusted me to know when to use it. As the courtroom emptied, my father crossed the room toward me, slowly, the walk of a man carrying something he does not know how to put down. He stopped a few feet away and looked at me, really looked at me, in a way I was not sure he ever had before. He said, "I thought I knew everything about his estate." "I thought we had covered everything." I said, "I know." He said, "He never told me about the trust." I said, "No, he did not. He did not tell you about the trust for the same reason he recorded those meetings. Robert, because he loved you and he could not trust you. And he spent the last years of his life carrying that distinction alone, without telling either of us. Because he was trying to protect everyone, including you. The one thing you forgot, the one thing you did not stop to check, was whether your father had already made his own plans long before you made yours." My father looked at me for a long time. Then he nodded, once, slowly, and walked away. That nod was the closest we'd ever come to honesty with each other. And for now, it was enough. The trust was substantial, more than I had expected. Grandpa George had been quietly careful his entire life, in the way that men of his generation often were, spending less than they earned, saving without announcement, building something solid and unglamorous over decades. The first thing I did with it was nothing. For 2 weeks, I went to work every morning and helped children find books. I drove home in the evenings and sat on my own small porch with Carol and watched the light change. We talked about ordinary things. We drank ordinary coffee. And slowly, the noise of the past several months began to settle. Then I made decisions, not financial decisions, human decisions. The farmhouse and 11 acres were offered on a long-term fair lease to a local farming family. Fourth generation, who had been working land in Medina County since 1931. The kind of agreement that lets people stay on land their families have worked. The kind of thing Grandpa George would have done without being asked. A portion of the trust established annual scholarships for students pursuing degrees in education, library science, and social work. Practical amounts. The kind that change a trajectory without requiring a monument to the giver. At the first scholarship ceremony, a 20-year-old woman, the first in her family to attend college, stood at the podium to accept her award. She said, "I did not think people like me were allowed to become librarians." I cried in the parking lot afterward. The good kind of crying, the kind that comes when something true has been said out loud and witnessed. Tyler called 8 months after the final hearing. His voice was different, quieter, like something had been removed from it that had been there for years. He said, "I owe you an apology. Maggie, I know it is not enough. I know it does not repair anything. But I keep thinking about Grandpa sitting in that workshop, recording those conversations, doing all of it alone because he could not trust us. He deserved better from me." I said, "Yes, he did. So did I." We were both quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I miss him." I said, "Me too." That conversation did not fix 30 years of distance. Life is not that simple. But it was a beginning, small and fragile, the way real beginnings usually are. My father never apologized directly. Some men carry their pride like a second skeleton, and it holds them upright even when everything else has collapsed. We speak on holidays now, carefully, civilly. At 62 years old, I have made peace with the understanding that not every wound heals completely. Some simply stop bleeding. That has to be enough. Several months after the case ended, I returned to the farmhouse one last time to sort through the remaining belongings. Most had been distributed. Only a few boxes remained. Inside one box, tucked into an old coffee tin and wrapped in a dish towel, I found a small envelope. My name on the front in his handwriting. My hands were shaking when I opened it. The letter was 3 paragraphs long, short and direct, exactly the way he talked. The final paragraph read, "If you are reading this," then things unfolded the way I feared they might. "I am sorry you had to fight. I am not sorry I trusted you to fight well. Money has a way of revealing character. Some people chase it, some protect it. The rarest people are those who remember it, is not the point. The greatest inheritance is not property. Maggie, it is knowing exactly who you are when someone tries to take it from you. You always knew. I just wanted to make sure you had the proof." I sat in that farmhouse for a long time, watching the evening light move through windows I had looked through 1,000 times, thinking about a man who had survived a world war and then spent his final years quietly, carefully, methodically building one last protection for the one person in his family who had never once asked what she would receive. He knew, he had always known, and the brass key had never been about a lockbox. It had been about trust, his trust in me. I want to leave you with what I have carried from all of this, because I think it deserves to be said plainly. Your labor has dignity regardless of what it earns. The work of showing up for people, of being present when presence costs you something, is not a lesser life. It is the highest expression of what it means to be human. Do not let anyone's accounting system become your own measure of worth. Presence is a choice made every single day. And people notice who makes that choice for them, even when they cannot say so, even when they are 86 years old and tired and trying not to be a burden. They notice. Sometimes they write it down in a letter inside a coffee tin. Sometimes they leave you a brass key and trust you to know when to use it. If you have an elderly parent or grandparent in your life, please know their legal rights. They have the right to independent counsel, the right to understand every document they sign, the right to make decisions without pressure from the people who stand to benefit. If something feels wrong, please speak up. Adult Protective Services, the National Elder Law Foundation, the Elder Care Locator. These resources exist. Please use them. And to everyone who has ever been the quiet one, the overlooked one, the one nobody worried about because you always handled things yourself, I want you to hear this clearly. You were never invisible. The right people always saw you. My grandfather saw me. He planned for years, alone, in secret, at great difficulty, not to win an argument, but to make sure one person he loved would be protected and recognized. Not because I was his favorite, because I had shown up again and again, without expectation, without scorekeeping, without asking anything in return. Character is what you do when there is no audience, when there is no reward waiting, when you are doing it simply because someone needs it and you are able. That is the inheritance that lasts. That is the one no affidavit can declare and no court can contest. My father celebrated too soon that morning in the courtroom. He made one mistake, signed one document, forgot one possibility. He forgot that the man he was trying to outmaneuver had survived things far harder than a probate proceeding. He forgot that the quiet daughter with the library job had been paying very close attention for a very long time. He forgot the trust. And in the end, that is all it took. If this story reminded you of someone who quietly showed up for you when it cost them something, take a moment today to tell them. And if you are the person who has been quietly showing up, please know that what you do matters. It is seen. It is remembered. And sometimes it changes everything. Thank you for spending this time with me. Take care of the people who are still here.
People always ask me about the courtroom. The recordings. The moment the affidavit became the thing that ended my father's case. The look on Tyler's face when the trust was read into the record. And yes, every single word of that happened. But here is what I want you to walk away carrying, because I think this story was never really about a legal case. Not at its heart. It was about a question that most of us are quietly asking our whole lives. Does it matter? Does showing up without applause, without recognition, without anyone keeping score, does it actually matter in the end? And the answer, at least from where I am standing, is yes. Profoundly, permanently, irreversibly yes. My grandfather George Holloway was 86 years old, in declining health, in a farmhouse that had gotten very quiet, and he was watching the people around him sort themselves into two categories without even realizing it. The people who loved him, and the people who loved what he represented. He never said it as a judgment. He said it as an observation. A quiet, clear-eyed observation from a man who had spent his life learning to tell the difference between things that were real and things that only appeared to be. And then he did something that I think is one of the most remarkable things a human being can do. He planned. Quietly. Carefully. Alone. Not out of bitterness. Not out of revenge. Out of trust. He trusted that the truth would matter if someone was willing to carry it forward. He trusted that the work of showing up, year after year, Tuesday after Tuesday, through snowstorms and hospital waiting rooms, and too strong coffee on the back porch, that work had meaning, that it deserved to be witnessed. He was right. So here is what I want to leave with you today. If you are the person in your family who shows up, the one who handles things quietly, who asks for nothing, who drives through ice storms because somebody needs you, please hear this. You are not invisible. You have never been invisible. The right people see you. They always have. If you have an elderly parent or grandparent in your life right now, please go see them. Not to discuss their finances. Not to plan for the future. Just to sit with them. Just to be present. Because presence is a gift that cannot be given back once the chance is gone. Trust me on that. If you are watching someone you love being rushed through decisions they do not fully understand, speak up. Every person has the right to independent counsel. Every person has the right to understand what they are signing. Silence in those moments is not kindness. It is the most expensive thing you will ever give away for free. And finally, the one mistake my father made was not a legal error. The legal error was a symptom. The real mistake was assuming he already knew everything, moving so fast, with so much confidence, that he never once stopped to ask, "Is there something here I have not considered? Is there a person in this story I have underestimated?" Arrogance closes doors before you even know they existed. The people we overlook, the quiet ones, the patient ones, the ones who show up with groceries on a Tuesday because somebody needs them, those are exactly the people we should never, ever underestimate. Character is not what you do when people are watching. It is what you do when no one is. When there is no reward coming. When you are doing it simply because it is right, because someone needs it, because love does not require an audience. That is the inheritance that lasts. That is the one no court can contest and no affidavit can take away. Thank you for spending this time with me today. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And take care of the people who are still here while they are still here. Until next time. This content was manually researched, developed, and edited by our team with the intention of bringing genuine meaning, human value, and lasting lessons to every person who takes the time to listen. Every story we tell is built with care because we believe that the right story, heard at the right moment, has the power to change how someone sees themselves, their family, and the world around them. Thank you for being part of this community.